Record to this computer. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we'll get started. Actually, tonight we're supposed to start talking about the Tanakh, so I'll get back to that in the more general sense. But first, this week's Torah portion is Vayishlach. Jacob, at the end of last week's Torah portion, and Jacob and his father-in-law have settled things between them, and Jacob is setting out on his journey back to the land of Israel, Eretz Canaan, as it's known at that point in history, back to his father Isaac eventually. And so he sends messengers to his brother Esau to let him know he's coming, and the messengers come back and they inform him that Esau is coming to greet him with a large number of soldiers with him. Okay, and so Jacob is very nervous about all of this. And so it says he divides his camp in two in case one camp gets attacked, the other one can escape. And after that's all done, everybody's crossed the Yavok River. And he goes back to collect a few items. And when he goes back, he's confronted by a stranger who wrestles with him. And it's not clear who this was. In the JPS translation, Jacob was left alone and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. When he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he wrenched Jacob's hip in its socket so that the socket of his hip was strained as he wrestled with him. Then he said, "Let me go, for dawn is breaking." But that must the stranger, the man. But he, Jacob, answered, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Said the other, "What is your name?" He replied, "Jacob." Now remember, Jacob, Yaakov, derives from the word for heel, Akev, Ayin Kuf Bet. Yaakov, you put Yud in front of it. So it's the usurper, the one who comes afterwards, comes in the heels of somebody else. So it has a certain negative connotation to it. So he says, Jacob, and said he, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, Yisrael. For you have striven with beings divine and human and have prevailed. Yashar El, you have prevailed over that is divine." Jacob said, "Pray tell me your name." But he said, "You must not ask my name." And he took leave of him there. All right, so this very strange episode, this World Wrestling Association match between Jacob and the stranger, the World Wrestling Federation, not to be confused with the World Wildlife Federation. Okay, so it's clear that it's understood eventually that it was an angel, that he struggles with this angel of God. That's how it's understood. Once again, the angelic beings come across as looking like people. We saw that with the story of Abraham and the angels that come to greet him. Adi has the word heel, H-E-E-L, at the end of your foot. Okay. And so we find that throughout the Tanakh, as we'll come to it, that frequently angelic beings do not look like, as I said before, these guys with the white robes and the big halo over their heads. By the way, for those who are interested in the arts, the Byzantines did not put a halo. They put a gold square or a gold rectangle behind the heads of those who they wanted to say were holy. I don't know how that became the halo later on, but that's the original Byzantine art is that way. And the Europa, which I think we mentioned, the synagogue that has all the drawings on it, follow that same kind of pattern. Okay, so after that episode, Jacob is limping, and we're told that from then on, his descendants do not eat the sciatic nerve. That's where Jacob was injured, and a little bit of sciatic as a result of it. All right. As it says a few verses later, that is why the children of Israel to this day do not eat the thigh muscle that is on the socket of the hip, since Jacob's hip socket was wrenched at the thigh muscle. Now I point out that to this day, so whenever the story is written down, it's not meant to be understood as being contemporaneous, right? To this day, till today, wherever today is, that is what's been going on. When was that? That's a good question. We'll talk about that a little bit later this evening when we talk about the history of the Tanakh. So now Jacob's about to confront Esau. He's tried to send him gifts, try to make things go well with them. And we're told how he lines everybody up and they go to greet his brother Esau. And then he bows down to him and says, Esau ran to greet him. He embraced him and falling on his neck, he kissed him and they wept. And they wept. Looking about, he saw the women and the children. Who asked, are these with you? And he answered, the children, God has favored your servant. Okay, so they meet and they embrace. And we seem to have here an indication that the two of them are making up over the past. It's very interesting. If you have the Hebrew of the Tanakh, in the verse is in verse number 4, chapter 33, verse 4. It's not indicated in the English, but in the Hebrew, the words vayishakehu, and they kissed, right, all right, have dots above each one of the letters. He kissed him. Yishakehu, he kissed him. Have dots written above each one of the letters. There are several places in the Torah that we have this kind of notation. And it is in the Torah itself. This is if you open up a Torah scroll, you will see these words that have the dots over them, have them in the Torah itself. I know Mark's looking it up right now in his Hebrew Tanakh. That's one of the nice things of seeing your faces. I can see what you're doing. I know Adi was worried I was seeing me eating, and that's all right. But anyway, I'm not drinking my bourbon, you know. Halavai. No. I would not drink bourbon during class. After class, maybe, or before, but not during. I promise that. Okay. So anyway, why are these letters marked this way? It's obvious it's meant to call attention to something. And without going into to any great depth, this is one of the practices that may have been, according to historians, not traditionalists, but according to historians, may have been taken over from the Greeks. That in Homer, when Greeks were studying the works of Homer, if there was some word they wanted to call attention to, they put dots over it. Okay? And there's a wonderful article by Professor Saul Lieberman of blessed memory, who discusses this in his work on Greek in Jewish Palestine. Okay, so but the rabbi seeing this obviously want to give an answer. Why? What was it calling attention to? So it says that in the English, he embraced him. Esau ran to greet him. So he's obviously the subject of the pronouns that follow. Esau ran to greet him. He embraced him, and falling on his neck, he kissed him, and they wept. Okay. So Esau is kissing him. Now, depending upon your predisposition, it sounds like Esau is very happy to see his brother. There are tears of joy. He kisses him. He weeps over the lost time. They didn't see each other, whatever the past circumstances. So the rabbis themselves were of two minds. Some rabbis said, yes, is dotted over to say, indeed, Esau, even though we find him being such a bad character, in other places we're not so sure about his motivation. Here, Vishakeu, he kissed him in all sincerity. On the other hand, those who want to see Esau in a negative light said, wait a minute, don't be mistaken. This is still Esau. He kissed him, but it wasn't a sincere kiss. And why did he cry? Because he sought to bite his brother Jacob in the neck. But God made Jacob's neck at that time turned into marble. And so when Esau bit down, he broke his teeth, and he cried over his broken teeth. So that's the midrash. All we know is we have the word there, but Yishakehu kissed him, and then it opens the door to various interpretations. But it's clear that Jacob is not really that trusting of Esau. When Esau offers to go together with him, when he goes together with him, he says, no, I got the kids, and I got the kid goats, and I got my children kids, and there's walk slowly, and you go, and so he departs. Okay, then what happens? We have a very terrible story that follows right after that. The story of the rape of Dinah, just real briefly. Dinah's the sole daughter that's mentioned with Jacob. She goes into the city of Shechem, and she's seen by the son of the king, who rapes her. Jacob is floored. He doesn't quite know what to do. Dinah's full brothers are Simon and Levi. Reuven, all right, and so at first they make a deal with the inhabitants of Shechem that they will intermarry with each other, but the men of Shechem have to be circumcised, and so when they're circumcised, well, the third day in the greatest pain, Shimon and Levi kill all the men of the city of Shechem. And there's lots of literature and Jewish tradition going back and forth about this and how we can deal with it. We really don't have time to go over all of that tonight. But Jacob was very much bothered by it. And when we read at the end of the book of Genesis, the blessings that he gives his children, he brings that back up and basically reprimands his sons for what they have done. And then working our way real quickly through the next passages, God tells Jacob to go up to Bethel, where he's to worship God again. We're told about Rachel dying in childbirth. She gives birth to Benjamin, the last of Jacob's 12 sons, and she dies in childbirth. And then in order to end the story of Esau and his family, the Torah gives us the generations of Esau and what happens to him later on, and how he becomes associated with the kingdom of Edom and the Edomites. And thus is this week's Torah portion. I will start back with Hebrew next week, so we won't do it tonight. But what I want to do is do the introduction to the Tanakh. Now, just a second. Okay. That's not it. There it is. Okay. All righty. What is Tanakh? First of all, this is the Hebrew name for the Bible. You may have been educated, grown up, hearing the term the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay. First of all, we have to understand that title, Old Testament, New Testament, comes from the hands of Christian writers. And in the medieval period, they referred to the Old Testament, meaning the Old Covenant. Testament has the meaning of a covenant, agreement. The Old Covenant represented by the books of the Bible and by Israel of the flesh, were superseded, replaced by the new covenant of Jesus and Christianity. So the Old Testament means the Old Covenant, and the New Testament means the New Covenant. As a matter of fact, in Hebrew, the name for the New Testament is Brit Chadashah, new covenant. Obviously, in Jewish tradition, we don't think it's the Old Testament at all. There's nothing old about the covenant. It is the covenant between God and Israel. So the first thing is we prefer not to use the terminology of Old Testament, but rather either the Hebrew Bible or Tanakh. Now, Tanakh is a abbreviation, the letters Tav, the letter Nun, and then the Chaf Sofit. We, in Jewish tradition, like to have abbreviations. That's like we have the Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. He's referred to as the Rambam, which is Rabbi Moses ben, son of Maimon. So you take the initial letters, you get Rambam. Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, Ramban, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, various names like that. So that's one of the Jewish practices. So where does the word Tanakh come from? It actually is the Tav comes from Torah. The first letter of the word Torah, the book of the Torah of teaching of law, is the letter, begins with the letter Tav. Nevi'im, the prophets, which is the next section of the Hebrew Bible, means prophets. And so the first letter of the word Nevi'im, prophets, is the letter Nun. That's the second letter of Tanakh. And the last is the Chaf of Ketuvim. It should be a dot in there, but we won't worry about it right now. So those three letters together make Tanakh. And since this is, the Chaf is at the end of the word as our name, they use the final form. So Tanakh is an abbreviation for the three-part division of the Hebrew Bible: Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim. Torah, prophets, and writings. The Torah, 5 books of Moses, beginning with Genesis, Breshit, through Shemot, Exodus, Vayikra, Leviticus, Bamidbar, Numbers, and Devarim, Deuteronomy, the first 5 books of the Bible, are the 5 books of the Torah. Jewish tradition gives a special sanctity, position to the 5 books of Moses, Chamishe Chumshe Torah, the 5/5 of the books of Moses, 5 sections of Moses. And as we will say in a few minutes, its origins, at least traditionally, were believed to have been directly God's revelation to Moses. The next section, the Ve'im, the prophets, it covers several works that are basically historical works, namely the books of Joshua, Yehoshua, Shoftim, book of Judges, Samuel, Shmuel, and Malachim, Kings. That's the first few books of the prophets. And then we have the 3 major prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. And then what are known as the 12 minor prophets, only because their books are shorter. And they usually come together as one book, at least in one way of numbering the books of the Bible. And then the last section, Ketuvim, is hard to describe in a fair manner because it seems to have different kinds of things in it. You have the Megillot, the Megillat of Esther, the story of Esther, the story of Ruth. Both of those are basically historical kinds of works, or historical romances, as it were. You have the book of Psalms, Tehillim, poetry, prayerful poetry, Sefer Mishlei, the book of Proverbs, which are Proverbs, the guidance for life. The book of Job, written about the understanding of evil. Then you have the first and second books of Chronicles that are, again, historical works, Ezra and Nehemiah. All these are found lumped together in Ketuvim. So we have the books of the Bible thus cover a large range of territory. Furthermore, clearly there are different authors for some of the books. Now, the rabbinic tradition often tries to limit the number of authors that we have, so that, for example, they say the book of Samuel, both 1 and 2, and I'll come back to that in a moment, why it's 1 and 2, they say were all authored by Samuel. We have the Song of Songs and Ecclesiastes and what am I skipping? Proverbs were said to have been written by Solomon. Jeremiah was supposed to be the author not only of his book, but also the book of Lamentations, the Megillot. All right. But when we look at them, we see they have different attitudes, different ways of seeing the world sometimes, perhaps even contradictory. And one of the tasks that the rabbis had was trying to resolve some seeming contradictions. The Talmud records that there was debate over the sanctity of some of these works. The book of Ezekiel, the Song of Songs, all had their foes in the rabbinic groups of whether or not they should be accepted as being religious texts. Now, we don't have the Bible until much later in history. We have the various works of the Bible already in existence prior to the destruction of the Second Temple. In the caves of Qumran, where you have the Dead Sea Scrolls, all of the books of the Hebrew Scriptures, except for the book of Esther, have been found amongst those scrolls, plus other books that were not included in the Bible. Furthermore, even the prophets themselves, clearly we don't have everything that the prophet wrote. There are bits and pieces, and sometimes it's clear that they were a little bit jumbled and put together by an editor at some point in time. When we look at the way the prophets envision God and talk of God, they're sometimes very different in the way they're doing it. So you can't talk about an author of the Bible, of the Tanakh. You can talk about authors of particular books, but it's very different, but it's not possible to really talk about an author, although certainly Jewish tradition sought to paper over any discrepancies that may exist between the various books of the Bible, the 24 books of the Bible, 23 books of the Bible. All right. Now, I mentioned, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, First and Second Chronicles. Why is there, when you look at the book of Samuel, you'll see there's no clear reason to divide Samuel into two books. And it's theorized the only reason it's two books, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, is that originally they were written on scrolls, and it's a very large text, a long, lengthy text, and it's too much for one scroll. So it was divided between two scrolls. So hence First Samuel and Second Samuel, First Kings, Second Kings. what else did I want to say? This general introduction. Oh, the text that we associate is based upon what we call the Masoretic text. We don't have a book written by the hand of, Moses, his handwritten autographed copy of the Torah. We don't have any autographed copies of any books of the Bible. And we do know that there were differences between some texts of the Bible, different books in the Bible. I mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls, various works that were found in Qumran. These all seem to date before the destruction of the Second Temple. They were gathered there. It was some from the community of Qumran who were around there. Some identifying them as Essenes. A very difficult question to really understand who and exactly who they were, where this library came from. The scholars, you can write your PhDs on different theories and everything with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Plus, they're still putting many of them together because they were in pieces. It's a fascinating study, but it's way beyond us for tonight. But, for example, one of the scrolls that they found is known as the Isaiah scroll. And it's kept in a special place in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. And if you see it, if you can read Hebrew, you can read the Isaiah scroll. The print is very clearly the same Hebrew, maybe slight variations from what we have today. But it is certainly legible. And there are differences. There are some differences from in the Torah passages. There are differences in the prophetic passages. So we know that there were differences. We also know that the rabbis themselves were aware of variant texts. Then you have what is called the Septuagint. The Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Bible, originally just the Torah and then other passages. And some places in the Septuagint, there are differences from what we have. What we use is called the Masoretic text. It was the traditional text as understood by the rabbinic traditions, finalized. The oldest copy we have is the what's the name of it now? The Aleppo Codex. The Aleppo Codex. The Codex, by the way, for those who are not familiar with the terminology, means it's in a book rather than a scroll. The Aleppo Codex, which dates back to, I think, to the 1100s, in that give or take, is the oldest extant complete Hebrew Bible, and that's pretty much the basis of what we call a Masoretic text. And also, it was the Masoretes who came up with the Hebrew vowel system that we use to indicate voweling. That was not in the older copies. I mentioned the Isaiah scroll. There are no vowels to be found in the Isaiah scroll. And so sometimes the differences may be because you could put a different voweling in. Sometimes the difference might be because there's actually a difference in wording. If I have the chat in the middle of the screen, do you guys see it? Is it blank? Do you see that? There's no chat. That doesn't pick up there. I'm just worrying about recording. That's all. No, okay. Fine. It's just I didn't have it on the side. Let's see. Okay, it doesn't matter. I will answer some of those questions that were asked about on that in a minute. Okay. And so when we come to Isaiah, for example, we're going to come to a very important textual difference between what is in the Septuagint and thus Christian tradition vis-a-vis Jesus and the Messiah versus what we have in the Masoretic text, our text of the Bible. And then there are translations. Every act of translation is an act of interpretation. You have to understand that. You have to pick words from one language that match the meaning of words in a different language. And that's not always really completely the same. They always like to use the word chutzpah, the Yiddish word chutzpah. What is chutzpah in English? It's more than braveness. What's the definition of chutzpah? It's the guy who's on trial for killing his parents and he throws himself at the mercy of the court because he's an orphan. That's chutzpah. Okay, just something. In Yiddish, we have mechutin. This comes from the Hebrew, but it's mostly used in Yiddish. Mechutin. Mechutin is the parents of your child's spouse. They are the parents of the bride and groom are mechutins to each other. There's no word in English for it. You have to go through this whole thing. And who's my mechutin? My mechutin is the father of my son's wife. That's the only English you can have for it. In Hebrew Yiddish, it's a mechutin. What's the problem? Right? So you have to, and some words we don't know what they meant. Some words only appear once in the entire Tanakh. So you can't even know from context. Sometimes there are very nebulous or amorphous meanings behind things that you can't necessarily know for sure what the meaning is. And when it comes to the listing of animals in the Bible, when we come to the issue of kashrut, we mentioned about birds, we can't identify for sure many of the birds that are mentioned in Leviticus because we don't know for sure what those words mean. So all that is part and parcel of the act of translation. And of course, selection. I already indicated, right? Certain books were accepted for Jewish tradition. Other works were excluded. The entire corpus of the New Testament was excluded by the rabbis. One of the books that was excluded is in the Apocrypha is the Wisdom of Ecclesiasticus, or Wisdom of Ben Sira, also called Ecclesiasticus. And the rabbis quoted it a few times in the Talmud, but it was excluded from the Bible, at least rabbinic understanding of the Bible once it came into meaning. Then when I mentioned about the Dead Sea Scrolls, amongst the writings of the Dead Sea Scrolls are writings that clearly were part and parcel of a group, a sect within the Jewish world, but were not accepted by at least the rabbinic leadership and what became the Jewish tradition. So they are considered to be, some ask, are they heretical? You want to call them heretical? They're excluded. They're not part of it. All right? And certainly some people at their time might have thought of them being heretical. And if we didn't have the Dead Sea Scrolls, we would never have had any of those writings. Except there's interesting, there was one text that they found in the Dead Sea Scrolls that had been discovered in a synagogue in Cairo in the Geniza. Geniza is where they would put books that were no longer usable. And amongst them was this work, and there's a whole scholarly argument what it comes from, what it's all about, and when it was written, by whom was it written, and then it was discovered amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls as well. So they were excluded. And like I said, some of the versions that are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls vary from what is the accepted Masoretic tradition. I think that answers everybody's questions who had asked questions about it. Psalms is book. Psalms are songs. They're poetry. The book Sefer Tehillim, the book of Psalms, is all basically poetry, and variously usually written that way as we would write a poem. And so it was the rabbis of the first few centuries of the Common Era went around and decided which works were to be included in the Hebrew Bible and which works were to be excluded, which version of the works would be included, and which versions would be excluded. And that all ends up with what we call the Tanakh. Okay. I just want anybody, what I've said so far, anybody any questions about that? Okay.
I kind of do, Rabbi.
Sure.
So we put a lot of emphasis on the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. We cover it every week or every day during service, all the Torah portions. Is it that we focus on the Torah more than the rest of the Tanakh because the Torah is direct word from God as we know it, and the rest is up to interpretation / the interpretation of the people that wrote it? Or
okay, I would put it this way. First of all, in the tradition, or we're going to give you the very traditional understanding of it, because that's how we came to where we are today. Yes, the Torah was said to be the pristine, the most perfect form of divine revelation that could be. Moses spoke to God face to face, whatever that means. Any other prophet even says in the book of Deuteronomy, when I come speak to a prophet in the future, I will come to them in dreams. But Moses, my prophet, was face to face. So the Torah is regarded as being the supreme form of revelation, the most crystal clear, as it were. And very clearly, the various prophetic works are influenced by the reception of the prophet. The world in which they lived and how they saw things was certainly part of what they, how they saw God, how they envisioned God and his word. Jewish tradition would say that nothing in any prophetic work would contradict anything in the Torah. And if you think it contradicts, you just have to dig a bit to figure out where or how it's not contradicting. I mentioned about Ezekiel. There's certain issues about the temple, and so the rabbi says he's talking about the building of the third temple, not the first or second. Things like that. Some works, well, the Psalms are at least ostensibly written by King David and others. And they are human poetry expressing human desires for God. But while the Torah is the most central book of the Bible that is used in the synagogue, we read and use a good portion of the rest of the Tanakh. Yes, we read the Torah frequently, every Monday, Thursday, Friday, and Shabbos. But we also always have a reading from the prophets at the holidays and Shabbat morning. So the books of Samuel are used, the book of Joshua, Kings, Kings is used, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, many of the other minor, so-called minor prophets, Micha, Jonah, just to name a few, are read in conjunction with Torah portions or holiday Torah portions. The book of Psalms is used for a lot of our liturgy, a lot of our prayers. The 5 Megillot, the Megillot of Esther, Song of Songs, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, what did I skip? And Ruth were traditionally read in the synagogue. Esther on the holiday of Purim. Ruth was read traditionally on Shavuot. Song of Songs was read traditionally on Passover holiday time. The book of Lamentations is read on the 9th of Av. Ecclesiastes is read at Sukkot time. So those are all read. So a hefty portion of all the works, books of the Bible find their way somewhere into the liturgy. But yes, Torah Moshe, the Torah of Moses, stands on top, and the others come down on a lower level. So that, for example, the rabbis were very stringent about how, certain practices. If you have three separate works, sometimes, the Bible might come in three books: Torah, prophets, writings. If you had to pile them on top of each other, the Torah would have to be on top, the prophets next, and then writings on the bottom. And that kind of a hierarchy. If you have a separate book of Genesis versus a separate book of Exodus, Genesis comes on top, in order. So that all is part and parcel of that. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yeah, no, maybe. She's not responding anyway. Yeah, anybody else? Anything else right now? Okay. So now let's go to a little heresy. Jewish tradition, as did Christian tradition, understood the 5 books of Moses to be essentially the word of God dictated to Moses at Sinai, and according to others later on throughout the period of the 40 years in the wilderness, Midbar, ending with just before the death of Moses. And even to such an extent that, I mentioned earlier tonight, until to this day, the children of Israel don't eat the sciatic nerve, right? I mentioned that in the story of Jacob. So who said that? Moses. He's talking about his day. Even though we've got the Torah, and the Torah now forbids us eating sciatic nerve, know that this was a tradition that predates the Torah itself, or at least the written Torah that we have now. Okay, so Moses wrote that. So the question is, at the very end of Deuteronomy, when we're almost finished with the entirety of the story of, sorry about that, Moses and the people of Israel, we read, good. Okay. Chapter 34, Moses went up from the steppes of Moab to Mount Nebo and to the summit of Pisgah opposite Jericho, and the Lord showed him the whole land, etc., 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 etc. The Lord said to him, "This is the land which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will assign it to your offspring. I have let you see it with your own eyes, but you shall not cross over there." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab at the command of the Lord. He buried him in the valley in the land of Moab near Beit Peor. No one knows his burial place to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were undimmed, his vigor unabated. And the Israelites bewailed Moses in the steppes of Moab for 30 days. The period of wailing and mourning for Moses came to an end. Now Joshua, son of Nun, was filled with the spirit of wisdom because Moses laid his hands upon him, and the Israelites heeded him, doing as the Lord had commanded Moses. Never again did there arise in Israel a prophet like Moses, whom the Lord singled out face to face for the very signs and portents that the Lord sent him to display to the land of Egypt, against Pharaoh and all his courtiers and his whole country, and for all the great and mighty and awesome power that Moses displayed before all Israel, which of course is also, once again, explaining why the Torah is higher than any other book. Who wrote this? Moses is dead. So who wrote it?
Didn't you say he laid his hands on Joshua and he's the next one?
Correct.
That be the next person to write?
Correct. So there's an opinion in the Talmud that the last few verses, this last chapter 34, the last 11 verses, whatever number exactly, 11 verses, were written by Joshua. Okay, that's a statement in the Talmud. One of the rabbis, another rabbi had nothing, no way, impossible. Nothing in the Torah could have been written by anyone but Moses. So how did we get in there? Moses wrote it in a prophecy. He foresaw the future. He writes about his own death. Here's the man who's so humble. He's got the known as the most humble of men, and he writing such praises about himself, even at the hand of God. In the beginning of Leviticus, the word Vayikra is written in a certain way, and one of the Talmudic explanations for it is because Moses was so humble, he wanted to take himself down a notch or two. So the letter Aleph at the end of the word Vayikra, he called out to him, is written small, so it looks like it's not Vayikra, but Vayikar, that God just came upon him, rather than God called to him. So Moses even changed or wanted to change the writing of a letter in the Torah because of his humility. So he's going to talk about how great he was. But that's what the rabbi said. So they wouldn't even accept the possibility that anything in the Torah comes from any other hand but Moses. There are some other places in the Torah which uses the kind of language until this day, just like we had with Jacob story. Ibn Ezra, one of the important medieval Spanish exegetes, commentators on the Torah, he suggests that a later prophet wrote that, added it to the Torah. He's taken the task by most of the other commentaries, but he was willing to admit that. But except for here and there, these kinds of things, universally, the Torah was seen to be one work written by Moses from the voice of God until close to the modern period. One of the first ones to start to question this in any great detail was Baruch Spinoza, Benedict Spinoza. In his writings, he begins the process of biblical criticism, critiquing the Mosaic authorship of the Torah. Now, in the last couple of hundred years, we have seen arise a theory of the origin of the Torah that insists that the Torah that we have is not even a unified writing, but it is a result of editing different books, creating the one book of the Torah. The 5 books of Moses were compiled from different sources. This is known as the documentary hypothesis. And based upon certain wording and certain senses of repetition that are to be found in the Torah, these individuals, these scholars insist that you can see that there were seams that were not completely concealed in the creation of the Torah. So that, for example, why do we have in Genesis chapter 1 through the beginning of chapter 2 what can seem to be one version of the creation story? And then starting in chapter 2, what can be seen as a different creation story? How is it that in the story of Noah and the flood, you can read it, one seems to indicate the flood was only 40 days and nights. Another indication was an entire year. How come in the book of Exodus, which we'll look at tonight later, the 10 Commandments differ in some ways from the 10 Commandments as they appear in Deuteronomy? So what is called the documentary hypothesis, JEPND, based upon the German understanding of the different names of God used in the Torah, said that there were these 4 documents that paralleled some ways, some had information the others didn't have, and at some point in history they got put together like this, but you can sometimes see some of the seams in it. That's the so-called documentary hypothesis. Certainly in the Orthodox world, that is rejected most universally. There are a few that may say there's something to it. One of my teachers, who should live and be well, Rabbi Dr. David Weiss Halivni, who was very traditional, although also a critical scholar. The way he tries to reconcile this is to say that during the period of the first temple, we know that the Israelites sinned, and perhaps they didn't take care of the Torah properly, and so there were issues, problems that arose of copying and recording it properly. And Ezra the scribe comes along and tries to pull it back together to make it the original version that was given to God to Moses at Sinai. So he kind of wants to try and maintain the divine authorship, but also recognize what seems to be some of these issues about various strands. Others reject it totally. So if you look at the liberal Jewish and Christian world, the documentary hypothesis reigns supreme. Although it's been taking a lot of hits and it's not necessarily that clear, some version thereof is pretty much taught in those institutions. So even in the Catholic Church, you will find that being taught that way in the Catholic traditions. Not in the fundamentalist Christian world, not in the Haredi Jewish world, the Orthodox Jewish world. That is pretty much rejected. As I said, there are some scholars, some Orthodox scholars who would entertain a little bit of this, maybe some things like even some of the older commentaries that something got slipped in here and there in the Bible, in the Torah itself, but majorly, for the most part, assume the unity of the Torah from Moses. Okay. I don't demand one believe one way or the other. People ask me, what do I believe? And it depends on the day of the week, sometimes on the time of the day, because I see some of the problems, but remember, the rabbi saw all of these problems. Every single issue that modern scholarship examines and claims to be proof of multiple documents being put together in the Torah, the rabbis were well aware of all of these questions. Their response is different. They saw the Torah as being the word of God, and therefore they sought some way of smoothing out what seems to be contradictions or rough edges, and therefore maintain the unity of the Torah. And that is certainly part of the task that many of the traditional commentaries followed. Not that they had anything like the documentary hypothesis that they were dealing with, but they were dealing with these questions, these issues, the seemingly double story of creation. If you remember, we have day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, 5, 6 in chapter 1 of Genesis, and then the Sabbath, a nice orderly rendition. Then in chapter 2, all of a sudden, there's no man yet. God hasn't caused the waters to rain on the earth, et cetera, et cetera. And so the rabbi said, no, the first chapter is a general highlight of the story. And then in chapter 2, it goes in more details about what transpired. Only 3 opinions? No, there are more than that for the Talmud.
I was trying to be, a low key.
Okay.
Yeah.
But although interestingly enough, often the arguments are based on 3s. The number 3 is a very powerful number in recording of difference of opinions is often 3s. Sayings are often recorded in 3s.
Somebody has to break that tie.
No, sometimes it's a 3-way tie. A says something, B says something, C says something, and they're all mutually exclusive. So it doesn't always work that way.
Touche, Rabbi, touche.
We will look at some Talmud in a few weeks from now, and you'll see how the rabbis operate. Okay. So as I was saying, though, in the Jewish world, you will find the more liberal giving less weight to the divine aspect of the Bible in general, are open more to a more human element in the creation of the Bible in its totality, starting with the Torah all the way through. And that, of course, buttresses their theology, which permits a more liberal understanding of how to interpret Jewish tradition in the modern world. And on the other hand, the more traditional, who accept the Bible and rabbinic tradition more strictly, are going to reject any attempt to undermine the authenticity and the authority of the biblical rabbinic account, and therefore are less open to changes in Jewish tradition and law. So the idea of the origins of the Bible very much tie in with theology and approach to Jewish law and tradition. So it's not, so would not expect there to be a single you won't expect in the Orthodox world much openness to biblical criticism, except on a very low level. And in the more the liberal world, there would be no opening for the more traditional understanding of the Bible, because if you have a very traditional understanding of it, it's hard to support your changes, your version of how Judaism should be today.
Rabbi, can I add something?
Yeah.
To the question that you were just asking, you look at it, the more conservative Jewish tradition looks at the Torah as law, black and white. There is no going around it. So if you start imposing the idea that the Torah could be not one word, you automatically undermine the authority of it being literal.
Of course.
Hence why it makes sense
that
in the more liberal circles, it's viewed as, yes, it's potentially true, but in a more orthodox, it cannot be true because it will undermine potentially a lot.
Yeah, there's no question about it. You've got it exactly. Because, as I say, we'll talk about it more later on, but one of the issues, modern issues, the role of women, or let us say sexuality, somebody being gay, and how that fits in with what Jewish tradition teaches about how a person should act and be. I'm not going to go into great details right now, but the more traditional will say when it says in the Bible that a man should not lie down with a man as with a woman, that's an absolute forbidding of homosexual practice by men. The doors are more open for women there, but right, but if you say that this is not the word of God, but it's a social practice that was part and parcel of the world then, and is not necessarily what we have to follow today, then you're going to be more amenable to opening the door for those kinds of things. It's very clear. If you take the Bible, the Torah, as a word of God saying X, you may be able to deal around it a little bit, but you can never say X is okay. All right? That clear?
It's kind of like what's happening at the Western Wall with the women wanting to wear the tefillin or the talit and pray in a different spot.
That's not really Torah law things there, but that's it.
Oh, sorry, I was recalling it more to men should wear men clothing, and tefillin talit is seen as a male.
Yeah, that's correct. You're absolutely correct. And so so obviously theology and history and all these things go together to create your vision of everything that's around you. You can't separate them. Yeah.
Rabbi,
Yes.
if sorry to continue, just I guess curious, but how flexible is conservative Judaism? How flexible is liberal Judaism, like with theology? Because like, what if you can't? Can you always square certain beliefs, and will it always fit? If you want to be Jewish, if you feel Jewish?
That depends upon the speaker and the rabbi and their take on things. I know Adi wanted me to talk about this a little bit because on the test we had last week, the idea, who's a Jew? What makes somebody Jewish? And that was our first class, and we started talking about that. And the best answer I can give onto understanding it is what makes somebody a Canadian. There are two ways that you can be a Canadian. You can be born in Canada, or you can come to Canada and become a citizen under this Canadian law, right? If you're born in Canada, you can believe whatever you want. You can believe there should be a Queen of Canada. You should believe there should be no Queen of Canada. You should believe that Canada should have a communist regime or it should have a fascist regime. You're still Canadian because you're born here. You're born a Canadian. Whatever you believe, whatever you do, does not take away from your being a Canadian. If you want to come to Canada, become a citizen, there are rules and regulations that you have to meet in order to become a citizen. So now let's look at Judaism. If you're born a Jew, you're Jewish. Makes no difference what you say, what you do, how you act. The worst thing could be is you're a bad Jew. Although I've had people say, Rabbi, how can you say I'm a bad Jew? I didn't say you're a bad Jew. These aren't things you're not supposed to do. Okay. But you're a Jew. Even though one's a sinner, you're still a Jew. Even if you convert in Jewish tradition, you're still a Jew. You're a sinner, but you're a Jew. Okay. One of the famous cases in Israel, and we'll come back to this, was the brother Daniel case. He was born Jewish. He was saved during the Holocaust. He became a monk, a Christian monk. He wanted to come to Israel on the law of return. The Israeli Supreme Court basically said, even though by traditional Jewish law he's Jewish, we're not going to accept that for citizenship in Israel. Once you accept another religion, you've cut yourself off that way. But they clearly understood that really by the strict letter of law, Jewish law, not Israeli law, they're different. By the strict letter of Jewish law, he was Jewish. On the other hand, if you're not born Jewish, if you're not born in Canada, you want to become a Canadian, you want to become a Jew, you have to go through whatever process is accepted as being the process for becoming Canadian, becoming Jewish. Different groups in Judaism have their ways of understanding it, and that's what gives rise to some of the problems. It's like, what if Quebec had their rules for becoming Canadian, and Ontario had theirs, and New Brunswick, different places had their rules, we'd have problems. But that's what we have in the Jewish world today. Okay, we don't have we don't have a chief rabbi, which floors people. I talk to them. We don't have a pope. Okay.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I didn't mean to be interrupting, but I think the question, or the way that I understood it, was he was asking, how far does the liberal movement differ from the conservative movement versus Orthodox? I think that's what he was asking for. Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's fine. We will see when we go to, in the spring, we have about the different movements in Judaism. And in a nutshell, you have on the far left, that's my left hand, all right? On the far left, the most liberal, those who consider to be part of the Jewish world, have a very open understanding. They don't believe in law. They don't believe in halakha in that sense. Jews are what Jews, Judaism is what Jews do. And if you don't want to do it, all right, you can become Jewish without, even when some would say you don't have to believe in God to become a Jew. And I'm talking about somebody who's born a Jew. Well, that's a separate question. And they might say, you don't have to keep kosher. You don't have to observe Shabbat. All you have to do is want to be part of the Jewish people. That's good enough. On the other hand, on the most right wing of the Jewish world, not only do you have to believe everything, you have to practice everything, and you have to practice it the way these people practice their Judaism. So there was a young woman who originally came to my class, then became almost part of my family, really. And she eventually had an Orthodox conversion as well. And when she was going through that Orthodox process, her teacher insisted she had to wear dark colored stockings. She couldn't wear nude stockings. They had to be dark, because that's what they did in that part of the Jewish world. Now, then you have those of us in the middle and different versions of it. We have different ideas. There's no question. The reality of the conservative movement today is divided, so that we don't even have any longer a single Beit Din per se here in Toronto for the Jewish community, because some rabbis are prepared to accept some things when other rabbis are not prepared to accept others. And so rather than have, it used to be the most traditionalist of the rabbis were the Beit Din here, okay? And so we all agree you're supposed to keep kosher, but some of us would say, as long as if you go to a restaurant and you order a piece of fish in the restaurant, that's okay. While others might say, no, if you're going to a restaurant, you can't have something that's been cooked. If you want to eat some salad or something, that's okay, necessary. Some would say, you can, not only can you drive to shul on Shabbat, but you can drive to go visit people, what have you, on Shabbat, as long as you know it's Shabbat. Others would say, all right, if you're going to drive, you can drive to shul, but other than that, you can't drive. All right. So there are various approaches.
Sorry, Rabbi, I was wondering, so for people who converted to Judaism, who were not born Jewish, and then later on they convert to some other religion, like, does it apply to the rule that once you convert to Judaism,
Yeah, that's our tradition. If you once you enter, you can never leave.
So this part, was it like from, like, where did it come from? Like from actual Torah, or it was just like developed later on?
Well, I think what it comes from is that converting to Judaism is understood to be a complete conversion. If you convert to Judaism, you are a Jew. Okay? And a Jew has certain obligations that they are expected to follow. And if you don't follow them, you are misbehaving, you're not acting properly, you may be sinning, chotah, but you're still Jewish. So if that's true of somebody who's born Jewish, and we say that somebody converts to Judaism has the same equal status as somebody who's born Jewish, you can never not be Jewish anymore. The Torah doesn't talk about it. The Torah doesn't talk about conversion at all. We don't have any real information about conversion until around the beginning of the Common Era.
Doesn't it say to love the convert, or is that later on? Because
you see, now here is an example where the word is ger. Now the word ger actually means a stranger, an outsider. Later on, certainly during the rabbinic period, by the time of the rabbis, the word ger was used to refer to a convert. But certainly many times in the Bible, it's not referring to a convert. when Abraham is asking for the cave of Machpelah to bury his wife Sarah, he says, I'm a ger here. I'm a sojourner. The word lagur means to sojourn, to be there temporarily. So, and the ger, who is mentioned numerous times in the Bible, in the Torah, as being one of the parts of society that is in need of help. The orphan, the widow, and the stranger, the ger.
But surely converts were commonplace at the time of Moses. Moses' brother-in-law, wasn't Moses' father-in-law? Yeah.
Okay, Yitro. All right. Now we're getting back into the subject matter for tonight, the historicity of the Torah and all of that. It is unquestionable that the rabbis read the Torah in light of their world. Just like we tend to read anything in the light of the world as we know it. So that, for example, certainly by the time of the rabbis, the first few centuries at the end of the beginning of the Common Era, one of the highest things about Jewish life is to study, to learn Torah. If you don't learn Torah, you're not really where you should be. Ein bor chassid. If somebody who's an ignoramus can't be truly pious. Now we got a problem. What about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? Were they nobodies? Did they study Torah? Yes, they went to yeshiva. They learned Torah. What they learned exactly, but they learned Torah. They spent time in yeshiva because that's what a Jew should do. If you look at pictures of the different biblical scenes that are in books that are written for the very frum Jewish community, you would think that Moses wore a black hat and a long black coat. They just can't fathom that they wouldn't do that. How do you prove that you have to wear a hat? Then Jewish law, you have to wear a hat. It says, Vayetze Yaakov mi Beersheba. Jacob went out of Beersheba. He left Beersheba. What are you going to do? What do you do the first thing you leave the house? You put your hat on. So obviously Jacob wore a hat. We read, it's clear, now this is my perspective, for sure, that every age sees themselves reflected in the earlier periods. We read our lives into theirs. Conversion, I've got to get back to the Bible. Conversion probably doesn't really exist, at least before the Babylonian exile. I started off in this part of our conversation about being a Canadian. Before you had the formal idea that you had to take a test and swear allegiance to the crown and all of that, how did a person become a member of a state, a community? You came and you lived there. And eventually you're accepted as being part of the family. You should pardon, it's prejudice on my part, but when I hear this British accent, and then I look at the person who's speaking, and they come from Africa, or they come from China, wherever it is, and they have this wonderful British accent, it throws you a little bit. Of course they're British. There's no reason to say they're not British, but they're not, it's not the image that it comes to mind, right? British, the guy's got a bowler hat on, walks with a cane, whatever. Because we have certain images, and so we get ingrained with those images, and we tend to see things in a certain way. I apologize. I have a new phone, and I haven't learned how to use it completely correctly. Okay, all right. whatever. So were there converts at the time of Moses? Probably not. Did Yitro become a Jew? I don't know if that's really true in that sense. Certainly the rabbis read it that way. We're going to read about the book of Ruth later on in the year. Ruth is a Moabite, and she lives in Moab. And she marries Jewish men, Israelite men. Who converted her? When did the conversion take place? Not only that, throughout, and I always like when I read the book of the class, whenever her name is mentioned through almost the entire book of Ruth, she's always called the Moabite, Ruth HaMoavi. Now, that didn't stop the rabbis from seeing her as a prime example of a convert to Judaism. But I challenge you to show to me, prove to me anywhere that it says that she went to a Beit Din and had a conversion. It's not written anywhere in there. So when we talk about translation, reading and translating of any text is an act of interpretation. If it's even if in the language that you grow up speaking, it's still going to be an act of interpretation on the part of the reader. So getting back to the original question about the authority of the Torah, that's why the Torah has a greater authority, because it's not subject to Moses' interpretation. It was the divine revelation, as clear as could be, to Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher. And therefore it has that authority. How do we deal with the stories of Genesis? There's room. Maimonides, the great philosopher of Judaism, tends to see a lot of dreams and non-literal aspects that should be taken to it. But there are others who take it very literally. My Mechutin, my oldest son's father-in-law, when talking about Abraham coming down to Egypt, don't we have early in the story of Abraham, he goes to Egypt with his wife Sarah and with Pharaoh and all of that. How could Pharaoh not know who Abraham was and about that he was married to Sarah? He was such an important man. Everybody in the world knew who he was, because he's accepting the midrashic interpretation as being the literal story. That's fine. I can't do that. All right. When we talk about midrash, we'll see more about midrash. Okay. Let's hit a couple of things before the night is totally over. It's almost 9 o'clock and I haven't gotten there. All right. I want to talk about a couple of issues in Exodus. Sefer Shemot. We have the story of the confrontation with Pharaoh and all of that, and we don't have time to go over it. Maybe in the course of the rest of the year, when I go to the weekly Torah portion, I'll touch upon it a little bit. But one of the major stories, which of course gives the Torah its impact, is the account of the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. Okay, Moses and Israel are in the Midbar. They encamp around Har Sinai, Mount Sinai, wherever that is, subject to great debate. Everybody's supposed to prepare themselves for this moment, and then God reveals himself to Moses on Sinai, and it says God spoke these words, Aseret HaDvarim. The first thing to recognize is that in the Torah itself, it's not called Aseret HaMitzvot, the 10 Commandments. It's 10 statements. Now, statements can be commands, as it were, and some of these are clearly commands. But it's not really called in the Hebrew Bible the 10 Commandments. All right. Now, furthermore, how you divide them up, is subject to debate. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. You shall have no other gods besides me. Seems to be a commandment. Or is it? Well, you have no other gods before me is certainly a statement of command. Don't have anybody else. So I'm the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. What is the mitzvah there? What is the commandment there? According to Maimonides, is acceptance of God. Okay. Can't make a sculptured image of anything in likeness of what heavens above or below. Okay, so the second commandment is not to make any idols. The third commandment is you shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God. Fourth commandment, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son, your daughter, your male or female servant, etc., etc. Number 5, honor your father and mother. 6, do not murder. 7, do not commit adultery. 8, do not steal. 9, do not bear false witness. And 10, do not covet your neighbor's house, wife, property, etc. Okay. Now, if we had time, which hour is getting a little late, so we're not, when you look at Deuteronomy, you will see that the wording is not identical. For example, for Shabbat, here it says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. But in Deuteronomy, it's Shmorat Yom HaShabbat. Guard it to keep it holy. Here in Exodus, it is, why do we remember the Sabbath? Because the 6 days God made heaven and earth. The seventh day he rested. In Deuteronomy is because God took us out of the land of Egypt. In Exodus, I call it the universal concept of the Sabbath. God the Creator, universal. In Deuteronomy, social. That we have to rest because God took us out of Egypt, and there shouldn't be any kind of force of people being enslaved. So there are a number of differences. In the Friday night liturgy, when we recite the Lecha Dodi, the very beginning, Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad hishmianu el hamyuchad. The word Shamor v'zachor, God said it together, simultaneously. And God caused us to understand it. So the rabbis explain why are there two versions of it? Because God said them both simultaneously, and Moses wrote it down one way in Exodus, and he wrote it down another way in Deuteronomy. But they were all contained together. What's significant also is after we have the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, the Torah turns immediately to banning idolatry. Okay. Again, the emphasis time and time again against idolatry, against other gods. And then in chapter 21, we come to rules of societies. These are the rules you shall set before them. When you acquire a Hebrew slave, he shall serve you 6 years. In the 7th year, he will go free. Okay, indentured servant is essentially what they're talking about there. The rabbis understood it that if a person stole and he couldn't pay for back for the theft, he was sold as a slave for 6 years. But in the 7th year, he went free. And there are all kinds of rules that are mentioned there. There's a talk, then it talks about selling a daughter for this kind of a slave. One man can sell his daughter for a slave, and so the rabbis understood it, as in the text itself, it's really as a second wife, or a secondary wife. He who fatally strikes a man shall be put to death. if he did not do it by design, but it came about by an act of God, in other words, an accident, I will assign you a place to where you can flee. When a man schemes against another and kills him treacherously, you shall take him from my very altar to be put to death. He who strikes his father or his mother shall be put to death. There are a lot of capital crimes written in the Torah. The rabbis dealing with these said there's certain rules and regulations dealing with capital crimes. Namely, one, the person who is going to commit the crime, the capital offense, must be warned in advance and know that what he or she is going to do is a capital offense. You have to have 2 witnesses for that warning. Then you must have 2 witnesses who see the person carrying out that offense. And if you don't have both elements, the court cannot convict him and execute him. And very clearly, in the Talmud, when they talk about it, one of the rabbis says, if a court executes a person once in 7 years, is a bloodthirsty court. Another says once in 70 years. And another rabbi says, if I were there, they would never execute anybody. And Rabbi Gamliel says, increase murderers in Israel. So the same debates that we have in the modern world were debated then. But what's important to know is that when the rabbis were bothered by something, generally speaking, they would never, God forbid, say that the Torah is telling us something wrong. They would find a way that they believed to be legitimate to make it impossible to accomplish what the Torah says in that passage. So it made it virtually impossible to execute anybody for anything. Be that as it may, we know that there were times, even in the ages when the rabbis did not have the right, or the Jewish community didn't have the right to execute people. If they felt threatened, they found ways to deal with them. You lock them in a room and you forget to feed them. It was one way of executing people that they needed to take extrajudicial action. Later on in these same passages, we have a very famous passage that I want to share with you for a minute. It says, when men fight and one of them pushes a pregnant woman, okay? 2 guys are having a fight, and this pregnant woman steps in, or whatever, however she's there, and one of them pushes her, strikes her, something happens to her. And I want the Hebrew, that text just has the English there. All right, so it says, if they're struggling to fight, and the Hebrew says v'yatzu yoladeha, and the child goes out. Literally, that's what it means. The child goes out. Now, the English translation they have here is a miscarriage results. V'lo yiyeh ason, but no other damage ensues. Anoshi anesh kasher yasit alav bal ha'isha. The one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact from him the payment be based on reckoning. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Okay? So now, this passage is at the heart of the debate over the biblical and religious understanding of abortion. And that's based on how do you, so if 2 men are fighting and a woman is injured so that she loses her child, but she herself is okay, it's a fine, a penalty. It is not reckoned as murder. That's how Jewish tradition understands it. If she is killed, or injured in some other way, then the penalty is based upon her life. So the way Jewish tradition reads it is that the fetus does not have the same complete status as a full-fledged human being does. And there's differences of opinion in rabbinic tradition on how we interpret that completely. One being that she's regarded, the child, the fetus, is regarded merely as an appendage of the woman until she gives birth. To the other one, it says, no, the child is seen as a pursuer. It has an independent status, but because it may be threaten their life, then we have a different story. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself there. Let's just stop there for a second. Okay, so the church reads it differently. The church read it, if she gives birth, the child goes out. Remember, the Hebrew word is literally the child goes out. So they read that to mean it's an early birth. So there's a fine, a penalty. But if the child should die, the fetus dies, it's life for life. That lies at the debate between the church, or the Catholic Church certainly, and traditional Jewish law, and understanding the broad parameters around abortion. The Mishnah, later rabbinic tradition, makes clear the account is if a woman is giving birth and the fetus, there's a problem, the fetus can't come out. There's a block, it's whatever reason, she can't deliver the baby. Remember, now we're going back a couple of thousand years ago, before modern medicine. And even a cesarean usually meant the life of the woman was over, okay? You can cut, so she's in the stages of childbirth. So the fetus is almost 9 months old, or 9 months old. The rabbis said you can cut up the fetus to save the woman's life. If the fetus has already entered into the birth canal and is beginning to come out, now it's a separate entity. Right? And now you can't just simply kill that one for the other. But notice the distinction. Until the moment it begins to enter into the world, its status is below that of the woman. So Jewish authorities all agree 100% that if a woman's life is at stake, even up to just prior to the birth of the fetus, you're allowed to destroy the fetus to save the mother's life. That's a universal traditional Jewish perspective. Even everybody agrees with that. Now, once you move away from that exact circumstance, then there are variations. What if her life is only threatened by the pregnancy? There's not a clear indication she will die from that pregnancy. What if her mental and physical, her mental state would really be threatened by the birth of that child, that fetus? Is that significant enough to allow an abortion? And as you go down, here's where you start to have differences of opinion in the Jewish world. Some are more permitted, as long as the issue is the woman's health and well-being. That's the determinant factor. If it's a financial situation, if it's an inconvenient pregnancy, no. Jewish tradition really does not agree with the modern, what we simply say, it's a woman's body, she can do with it as she wants. What it says is this is life and potential. It is sacred. It is secondary to the woman's well-being. but it does have value and can only be sacrificed when it's clear that the woman is some way really threatened by that child, that fetus. And you can have various opinions of how far you go on that, but that is really the Jewish perspective on it, which is not it's a woman's body and she can do with it as she wants. Just like if I don't like my hand, don't like the way it looks, I can't just cut it off. I don't have a right to injure myself. And even if the fetus is regarded as merely a limb of the woman, that doesn't mean she has a right to do with it whatever she wants. So it's in between these visions of the abortion debate. And that comes from this passage. So how you read it and how you interpret it in a biblical account has significance. And the two words there, the three words, the child comes out and there is no damage. How you read those three words flavors how you understand that passage. Okay.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
So, sorry, and I know I'm linking it back to what we were talking about earlier, but let's say you want to convert to Judaism, but you do believe it's a woman's choice to do what she wants. Can you still be Jewish?
Yeah, of course. Look, that's a political statement. It's when I look at the issue in the general world, the political world, I don't want religious authorities deciding the law for everybody. If a woman comes to me and asks for my advice as a rabbi, I can tell her what I think Jewish law demands. And she can choose to accept that or not. Right? Now, there are rabbis who are more liberal and might say, yeah, it's a woman's choice completely. All right, so that's not the question at hand. The question is never a question belief so much as it is actions. That's actions speak louder than words. But as you can see, there's certain issues where there are various ways to look at it. Yeah, it's a woman's choice. Legally, it's always a woman's choice. That's our society, right? Our society has granted the ideology that a woman has a free choice on what happens to her body. That's a political decision. It doesn't mean one way. It doesn't mean the woman has to go one way or the other, right? We don't impose abortions on a woman. We don't prevent abortions from a woman. That's her choice. That's our legal system. But that's not necessarily how Judaism regards it, but as a legal thing. That's why I say I don't like the words, but if it comes to elections and voting, I'm, quote, pro-abortion. Because I am pro-life. Every life is valuable. Right? So, and I remember many years ago, there was a case in New York State. This is much earlier in the abortion debate, although that debate is still flying around us all the time, in the States anyway, in which there was an auto accident. A Jewish woman who was pregnant was injured in the accident, and the doctors felt that she had a better chance of coming out of the coma and being recovering if they aborted her fetus. They felt it was necessary to preserve her life. And any rabbi would tell you that's perfectly permitted. Somebody wanted to go to court and went to court to try and block it because they were so anti-abortion. That's the church's attitude. So just like I don't want the church telling us what to do, I'm not prepared to tell the church what to do. You want to preach to your parishioners one way, that's fine. And we can preach a different way. And then what you have is what is the public policy And that's where I might differ from my more Orthodox colleagues. I don't want religions getting too much mixed in public policies. Right? We may have our view, but I understand. I don't want religion of any sort, of anybody's approach, to start saying what can be and can't be. And there was just a, well, I don't go furthermore. You know, every serious question can only be answered in terms of that situation. Most poskim, you know, you can make general statements, but then each case has to be analyzed in terms of its own case. Okay? So that it's hard to make truly blanket statements. You make a general blanket statement, but you say, well, but of course there are exceptions to X, Y, and Z. See, I even learned to say Z. That's how I become Canadian I got to be. When we first moved to Canada, my daughter said something about Z, and the teacher says, "You mean Z, don't you?" She says, "No, I mean Z." Anyway, real quickly, it's 9:15 already. Just got to take you for a couple more minutes. Sefer Vayikra, which is the next book in the Torah after Shmot. Because after the story of the Ten Commandments, most of what follows, a good portion of it deals with the building of the tabernacle, which is the center of the concern of Exodus from then on. But Vayikra is the names of the biblical books, by the way. I think we mentioned this before. The biblical books are all based upon opening words. The first book of the Torah is called Bereshit because that's the first word. Shmot, Elish Shmot B'nai Yisrael, these are the names of children of Israel. Shmot. Vayikra Elohim El Moshe, God called to Moses. So it's called Vayikra. Okay. That is the Jewish way. The names of the books, of course, in English, all derive from both the Septuagint and then later through the Vulgate. The Septuagint was the Greek translation, and the Vulgate was the Latin translation of the Bible. And so the Greek style was to name books based upon content. So Bereshit is called Genesis because it's Genesis of the world. Exodus because of going out of Egypt. Leviticus because a lot of it deals with priestly issues, and hence Leviticus. Book of Numbers because there's a census at the beginning. Deuteronomy because it's a second Torah. Actually, there's a Hebrew name for it, the same name. Mishnah Torah, because a lot of it seems repetitious of earlier laws dealing in more detail. But Vayikra begins talking about sacrifices. And that's very strange for us moderns. But when you read in the details and you look over them, you see that for the most part, most sacrifices were consumed by people, not just burnt on the altar. Parts that were burnt on the altar were often the things that nobody would want to eat anyway. But it was, in many ways, a sacred meal between the person and God. Whether the priest is the one eating it or the person who brought the sacrifice was eating it. That's important to remember. But we find the laws of kashrut are mentioned in detail in Leviticus. Chapter 19 of Leviticus begins with Vaydaber Adonai Moshe lemor, daber kol adat b'nei Yisrael v'marta alehem kadoshim tiyu ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the whole Israelite community, say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." And this introduces what is called by many the holiness code. Now, we are try to be holy. What does it mean to be holy? And so the laws that follow are meant to teach us how do we be holy. Now, what does the word holy mean? Kadosh. The root for kadosh, kuf dalet shin, means separate, distinct. That which is separate and distinct is that which is holy. Just like marriage is called kiddushin, because a man and woman are separated from the rest of the world as a husband and wife. What follows are ways of being holy. And some of them are mentioned to deal with sacrifices. Some of them say, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap all the way to the edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall not pick your vineyard bare or gather the fallen fruit of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. There's the ger again. Stranger, I, the Lord, am your God. So caring for the needs of the poor is part and parcel of being holy. Just like how we treat sacrifices, how we treat the needy. It's interesting, by the way, we don't harvest and give it to them. You leave it for them to collect it, which means there's a certain degree of honor, of respect, because they're not just getting a handout. They have to work for it. They work for what that corner is. All right. You shall not steal. You shall not deal deceitfully or falsely with one another. Not to defraud your fellow. Don't commit robbery. The wages of a laborer shall not remain with you until morning. And there's their day and age, a day laborer. He had to be paid right away. You couldn't go overnight without being paid his wages. And there's discussions later on, the rabbis, what are fair wages? All these modern issues are start with the Bible and work their way through later on. You shall not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. If somebody doesn't see, that doesn't mean they can't see, literally. It means they're blind to something. You can't take advantage of somebody's weakness. That's a part of being holy. To curse a person who's deaf, he doesn't hear you when you curse him, so it doesn't matter? Of course, it still matters. Do not render unfair decision. Do not favor the poor or show deference to the rich. If you're in court, the court must decide the law honestly and fairly. That means if the rich man is correct in the case, he wins the case. If the poor person is on the side of the right on the case, he or she wins the case. Judges can say to the litigant, says, you got lots of money, this guy's got nothing. Why don't you just let it be? But they have to decide the case the way it is. That's being holy and righteous. Then the kashrut laws are part and parcel. So the Torah does not distinguish between ritual, social, political, any kind of distinction. All the practices of life, of society, are part and parcel of what the Torah is seeking to build. And here we see in clear terms why. Because we are supposed to imitate God and be holy. And how do you imitate God and be holy? That's what these are descriptions of. Okay? I know it's a little bit later tonight, but I told you, sometimes you get out a little early, sometimes you go a little longer. I could go much longer, but I have Rachmanis on you. You know what the term Rachmanis means?
No.
All right, well, in Hebrew, it's Rachmanut, or if you're an Ashkenazi, Rachmanis, it means mercy. What does the word mercy come from? The word rachem, resh, chet, mem, rechem, womb. To show mercy is to show like the womb. A mother has mercy for her children, that which comes from her womb. So, okay, ladies and gentlemen, you have a good night. Work on your questions for everyone. Did I answer everyone? Okay, that looks like it. Be well.
Thank you.
Bye.